thanks for the introduction. As Carl said, so I'm with the Invasion Science and Wildlife Ecology Lab, and predominantly we've been focusing on the links between the international trade of live pets and the biosecurity risks in Australia, mainly through the establishment of invasive species through escaped pets. I'm sort of presenting quite broadly today on behalf of our lab, so all the co-authors listed there have contributed to this in different capacities. And essentially, I'll just explain how we went through looking at the links between trade and invasion to actually developing a methodological framework for monitoring online trade. So here we go. That's good. And I will just get a screen pointer up. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. Great. So this infographic essentially just summarizes the problem in Australia. So we know that non-native live pets are entering the country, either they're being illegally imported or they're being smuggled through international borders. Once they're here, they're kept in captivity, traded between states and jurisdictions with ease, in no small part through the online trade as well. And from there, they are being released or they are escaping into the wild in large numbers with a high probability of establishment of potentially invasive species. So this is something we obviously want to prevent. To that effort, so far, we've been focusing on border seizures to see which species are entering the country and which of them might pose the greatest risk. And as you might have imagined, a lot of the species on the sort of top right of this figure here, so the species that are entering Australia at the highest frequencies are those that are very prominent in the international trade, and many of them have a history of being invasive elsewhere. So if you'd like to learn a bit more about that particular area of research, you can scan the QR code or follow the link. But essentially, that is the context that led us to have a greater prioritization of studying online trade itself, because we realized that these seizures are essentially a biased subset of the big picture. Hopefully I can change slides. There we go. These seizures are a biased subset of the whole of illegal trade. They're only what we are detecting. And similarly, documented trade is a biased subset of all of the trade that is taking place. So for example, we record the trade of our parrots in much more detail than we do the plant trade. So we've got biased views of the big picture. We need to have a more preemptive approach and have a more comprehensive view of what is actually being traded in Australia, and therefore predict biosecurity and conservation risks, which led us to investigate online trade. So just to give you a general overview of how use of internet has rapidly increased over recent years, sort of by the mid-2000s, we saw the advent of what we call Web 2.0, which is essentially a greater focus on user-generated content, led to a more centralized use of the internet, particularly through social media. And by 2008, we had 100 million active Facebook users, and within the last 2 years, we're now into the several billion social media users. So you might think, okay, but has that actually percolated through to wildlife trade, let alone the pet trade? And there's some recent evidence that suggests that is the case. So this paper from Marshall et al. Has identified more than 2,700 species of live reptile for sale online, including a high diversity of species that were not known to be traded previously. They suspect that about 90% of these are wild caught. And when you look at the native range of the species advertised for sale, you can see it's more or less global. So the use of the internet has rapidly increased the scale and the diversity of pet trade. So that led us to develop a methodology to rapidly collect online trade data. We needed to do that for our context, as I sort of explained earlier, and we decided if we need to do that, we might as well turn this into a paper so that other groups that are studying other contexts of wildlife trade can apply a similar methodology. So the QR codes here will take you towards the published guide and then the open access preprint of that same guide. So everything I present going forward is the guide which was led by Dr. Oliver Stringham, and he's also happy to communicate with anyone interested in further information. I'll be going through specifically these steps, so how to gather candidate websites, how to select suitable websites from those candidates, extract trade data from them and clean that data. And I just want to highlight that although we're using this in a very specific context for our lab, it can be used in a much bigger variety of contexts, of course, across different countries, different taxa, whether we're studying vertebrates as it happens, and you can also use it for non-live wildlife products as well. So identifying candidate websites. Fortunately, a lot of the more common search engines that are very popular in use have available APIs, so that's application programming interfaces. And what that means is that you can conduct a very large number of searches in a very short space of time, rather than doing it manually. So that's what we did, for example. You can see we used unique combinations of taxa, trade behavior, and country of interest. And we very rapidly acquired thousands of different website URLs, which is great. The problem then is how to sift through the relevant websites to study without doing it manually. One option is to use natural language processing, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But another useful technique we use is just to look at the website metadata. So we use this Alexa web ranking to identify the highest trafficked candidates of the websites, and therefore select the sites which have the highest frequency of trade. The problem is that everything I just described only really applies to what we call the surface web. So those are websites that are indexed on search engines and do not require any sort of private account to access. You can apply that same methodology to things like social media, except that A, you need an account, and B, the APIs of internal social media search engines are often not publicly available. And so you have to make searches manually, and you also cannot guarantee that that search is systematically finding content for you, although you can still apply the methodology. The dark web is not indexed on any search engine. And so if you're going to use the following methodology to those sites, you need to already be aware of which site you're interested in. So how do you actually collect wildlife trade data from a candidate? Well, we use a tool called a web scraper, which is otherwise known as a data miner, and it is essentially just a programming code that reads the HTML structure of a given website and extracts key information. So if I were to very simply summarize how we might sort of write that code in the Python programming language, we would ask the code to visit a particular URL. Within that URL, we would visit each product page in a list of product pages. And then for each product page, we would extract key variables. So for example, the title, the images, the price, any species names, and then consolidate that into a structured data set that we can use later. Now, this last step, the data cleaning step, is the most variable and context dependent. If you're dealing with a situation like here, where the HTML structure of your website is very consistent, so you can see here the species names are always in the same part of the product page, then the type of data you're going to be able to produce from a web scraper is going to be incredibly structured and is basically going to be ready for analysis immediately. So it's going to save you an enormous amount of time. Unfortunately, the reality often resembles something like this. The website will allow the seller to input a free-form text box where they can write whatever they want. They have no consideration for the fact that you're trying to study it. They may not put a scientific name. They may not even know the common name of what they're selling. They may put the price. They might write it as a number. They might spell it out. It will be riddled with non-target information. And so then that requires a lot of manual processing after collection. And when that happens, the scale of study becomes a major issue. So just to highlight what I mean, when we look at the initial set of candidates that we wanted to study, which was 58 websites across several different Western platforms, we've suddenly realized that we were dealing with around 13,000 new unique product listings every single week. And we're a team of under 20 people. So there's no question of whether we'd be able to manually process that amount of data. So you might think, okay, well, could we subsample that data, maybe get a representative sample and make it a little bit more manageable? We'd considered that. And two members of our lab, Katie and Steph, for a particular website, just looking at the trade of birds, this was a data set of about 60,000 listings. They went through each one and validated the scientific name of the species for sale. And you can find that even with subsampling, you need about 10,000 listings before you're actually getting a plateau in your species accumulation and you're actually getting a representative sample. So scale is a big problem. What can be done about that? Well, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, natural language processing is a very useful tool. Essentially, what this does is it just models data into particular categories based on the type of text that data contains. So for example, here, this might be relevant and non-relevant listing, and you are modeling the likelihood that a given listing is relevant based on the terms that it includes. So this term here might be, trade, whereas this one might be lost and found. The caveat there is that these natural language processing algorithms, they still require a subset of manually labeled data to train. So you still do need to do some manual labeling. Another tool is to use automated string matching. So for example, if you had a list of species names that you want to very quickly query against your lists, you could do that quite rapidly. But of course, you've got to account for the fact that these sellers might be accidentally misspelling the scientific names. They might be not using current taxonomic names. They might not even be using species names or even common names. So the bottom line is that there's always some element of manual processing. The extent just varies. So some other project considerations, maintaining your web scrapers. So for example, if a website wants to change their aesthetic and they change their HTML structure, the perfectly functional web scraper of yesterday will no longer work. You will need to recode that web scraper. Sometimes that can be quite a minor job, sometimes it can be a major job. Additionally, some sites will deliberately try to detect web scraping behavior. And what I mean by that is behavior that doesn't seem human. So for example, clicking between listings too quickly. And so you'll have to manually code in human-like behaviors to evade that detection. You also need the infrastructure to deal with the fact that you're, as I mentioned earlier, acquiring quite large amounts of data. So we tend to use sort of cloud-based storage, like MySQL databases. That works well for our needs. Some other considerations, we definitely recommend seeking ethical clearance to do this in a research context, because your data collection, especially if it's on social media, might require some element of deception or limited disclosure of your research. You potentially may be storing identifiable information. We also recommend anonymizing the websites that you study as part of your analysis and your publication, because an important consideration is that some websites specifically forbid web scraping in their terms of service. So some final caveats. Sorry. No worries. Just some final caveats. I sort of suggested that looking at online trade might be this green circle here, this big picture, unbiased subset of what's going on. That's not actually true. So for example, the methodology doesn't capture encrypted trade, so trade through private social media apps like WhatsApp. And of course, it doesn't capture physical trade, expos, pet stores, wildlife markets, and the extent to which a particular trade is online versus physical will fluctuate between the contexts. To use this for the dark web, as I mentioned earlier, you require a little bit of prior knowledge, and the availability of the data is dependent on the information that the seller and that website are willing to provide you. So just to conclude, the online wildlife trade is clearly prolific and rapidly growing every year, but we have new tools available to match the scale of trade with the scale of our surveillance. However, there are certain data and ethical demands that need to be seriously considered, but this is an opportunity to be proactive rather than reactive and detect potentially problematic trends before they actually start to have ecosystem level impacts. And just to highlight that we're always open to collaboration and discussion, and we hope the methodology is very useful to all the different contexts that have been discussed so far. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in contact, and thanks very much for your time.